Okay.
Michael Lynch. I just came back from the Battle Hardened in Chicago, where I went 6-2 with everybody's favorite Borvo. It basically made a lot of interesting plays throughout the weekend, and a lot of people were very excited to see what kind of different Bravo lists can come. Now, I'll start with the equipment. So, of course, I ended up running AB3, starting with the Null Rune gloves. I also went ahead and ran Null Rune boots and the Arcane Lantern. Now, basically all of these were just because of the fact that I did expect that Icelander would make an appearance based on the latest trend, and I definitely wouldn't be caught without 3AB going into the meta that we currently have.
That makes sense.
My 2 losses, unfortunately, I lost to a very talented Icelander player, and Kano was also the matchup that I was not excited to see. But that's definitely something we have to make sure we're prepared for.
Okay.
I then ran Titan's Fist as well as Steelblade Buckler. Now, because of the fact this is a Royal Bravo deck, we're losing a little bit of block value when it comes to not running Crown of Providence. So Steelblade Buckler gives us that ability to make up for some of that by having an additional 3 block in our equipment. And that's when I usually am playing a little bit more defensive than I otherwise would be. Now, of course we're running Anthos. I mean, obviously, you're not going to run Bravo without Anthos. It's just too much value for what it does. Now, when it comes to the equipment, I ran Crater Fist, which is, of course, a Bravo staple. Now, I run this a little bit different than most people do, because the majority of matchups, what I was actually doing was using it for the 2 block, and then I was actually using its ability, which almost no Bravo uses, but because of the fact that we're able to produce so many seismic surges and reduce the cost, we end up having extra resources that can go ahead and make those crush effects actually matter and push through a Starstruck or a Crippling Crush at critical moments in the game.
Okay.
Now, Mage Master Boots is definitely something that's a little odd, but I actually run 2 copies of Tome of Fyendal, and the reason I do is because of the fact that everybody's favorite card, and the one I get the most questions about, Earthlore Bounty. Now, whenever we draw from the effect of an action card, we create that many Seismic Surge tokens. So, just by allowing us to play Crown of Dominion and starting the game with our little gold token, we're able to go ahead and play a lot of cards that just give us immense value. Because at the end of the day, Bravo is a very fair deck. And what this deck is trying to do is give him the opportunity to do unfair things. And we do that in a variety of ways. Now, what I'm going to do is go ahead and go through, basically the card pool. Now, so we're running 3 Inspiring Visage. Now, this combined with Showtime gives us a roughly 40% chance to see it in our opening hand. One of those, guaranteeing that we can go ahead and heave a Pulverize turn 1 and really get set up for us to go ahead and chain together these massive attacks.
And did you lose any games where you were able to actually pull that off?
No. I mean, it's very hard for me to lose from that starting point. Yeah. But it just so happened that, I mean, I'm sure it's possible, but I mean, it just didn't come up in my games.
Okay.
My games were typically not very close, just because I was able to do some pretty massive things. Now, Terra Sunder is another card that you'll often see with Bravo. I mean, it is one of our better cards, but one thing is the fact that with these extra resources and cost reducers, you often do have the 3 extra to be able to just go ahead and say, all right, now this is a hammer for 7 with Dominate, or throw in a Choke Slam, Disable, whatever the case may be, that really goes ahead and takes it away. Now, obviously, we're going to have to run a lot of blue Guardian attacks that are usually 6 to 8 power, and that is because of the fact that we are trying to enable Rouse the Ancients. Now, this deck does play Rouse the Ancients very aggressively and pretty often because of the fact that again, with those extra resources and the ability to not need to devote 2 to 3 cards to play something, it gives us a little bit of wiggle room. Now, a card that a lot of people thought was a meme, it definitely is an interesting one, Potion of Luck. Now, this actually came in handy in the 2 Bravo games that I was able to beat because of the fact that what I ended up being able to do was block with 3 cards, go ahead and play it, and then on a later turn I was able to go ahead and crack it in response to a hammer or a spinal crush, block for 9, and then be able to throw back an efficient attack that ended up basically switching tempo in my favor. And I found that was very consistent. Now, unfortunately, it is a no block, but in the majority of games, you are the aggressor, and you do have to play knowing that fact. Again, Showtime, another source of card draw, so it does give you a Seismic Surge for your next turn, in addition to drawing you up on that turn, so it does help, and but it also is mainly there to be able to heave a turn 1 Pulverize. Now, of course, you have some more very efficient attacks and just Guardian attacks that are going to go ahead and allow you to consistently have all of the ways to trigger Anthos by making sure their cost is over 3, and consistent for Zealous Belting as well. Now, I do run 1 copy of Pummel in blue. Now, a lot of people think that's kind of a weird one, but at the end of the day, when they see you pitch 1, they're playing around it the rest of the game, and that's something that gives you a lot of value for a very little investment when it comes to your card choices.
That's so true.
Now, that is all of my blues. Now, when it comes to yellows, now I run actually about, I would say, 8 yellows overall. So I run 3 Starstruck. Now, this card actually ended up being super powerful and one of the best cards in the deck because of the fact that, I played against a Phi opponent in round 2, and I was on the play. I dominated a Starstruck, and he did not want to give up equipment that early, so I ended up time walking him and then being able to play a Tome of Findel from Arsenal. And I started at 45, and my opponent was at 32, and there was no way for him to catch up. It was, frankly, pretty disgusting. Now, cash-in is something that you don't really see a lot of because of the fact that it's, pretty much never played outside of, Royal Dromai or a couple of these other decks. But just having that treasure token starting off in the game, that gold, you're able to sacrifice it, draw 2 cards, and what that does is it puts you at card advantage in that turn and effectively card advantage in the next turn. Because you're getting 2 Seismic Surges for free for your next turn. And another thing this is doing is allowing you to draw closer to your threats. So that way the odds of you maintaining the ability to chain together these big attacks, these on-hit effects such as Tear Asunder, Pummels, or meaningful on-hits like Spinal Crush and Crippling is just that much higher. And we also do that with Tome of Findel. And of course, gaining that life is so critical in aggro matchups, and it allows you to maintain not only aggressiveness, because it also is serving the same function as cash-in by putting you at card advantage at that turn, and effectively giving you 2 resources for the next turn that allow you to block with 2 cards, pitch a blue, attack with a disable, attack with, a big Spinal Crush, whatever the case may be, and it really puts you in the driver's seat. Now, that's it for the yellows. Now, one thing that I do run, and this one I always get questions about, Gorgonian Tome. Now, obviously, Gorgonian Tome is not a great card to draw for the most part because it doesn't have any block value, doesn't pitch, and the reason I'm running it is, frankly, because I didn't have the Grandeur, which is a blue that gives you that Seismic Surge for free. So this is just a placeholder until I get that, but it is a very cheap budget alternative that does give you a resource and just effectively filter through. So it's not bad, it's just not the greatest you could have. Now, when it comes to the reds, I always consider all of the reds to be more of a sideboard. Now, of course, some are always coming in, but you have your Spinal Crush. Now, Spinal Crush obviously is great against anything that's going in, constantly going wide. You have Crippling Crush, which is obviously going to be played in every single matchup. And generally speaking, what I like to do is have about 16 reds in the deck with the 44 cards that are not red. 2 Pulverize. Now, this is, of course, for mid-range matchups as well as the mirror. With Levia becoming more of a player in the meta and people kind of figuring out how that deck works, it's actually come in handy quite frequently. Now, I know it's sacrilege, but I only run 2 red pummels, mostly because of the fact that this is a card that, generally speaking, you want towards the end game to close out games, and the likelihood of it being a bigger factor in the middle game is roughly not as good as you throwing out these big attacks. And one of the ways that you can definitely lose momentum is when you can't throw out a meaningful attack that's putting out a lot of damage. Now, what this deck is really trying to do is pressure your opponent and getting them to that point where they have to block. Once they have to block, they're not putting out as much damage as they otherwise would, and that's where you really take over. Choke Slam is obviously very great against all of those brutes, as well as, you know, Lexi and Phi. Just a lot of decks that, you know, are trying to gain attack power on all of their things. And I know against Azalea, it was definitely a card that ended up, you know, being a very easy card to take away the game. I also run 3 copies of Red Zealous Belting. This allows me to be very aggressive into the mirror, into a variety of different mid-range matchups where I really want to take control. I mean, pitching a blue, attacking for Zealous Belting into a hammer is still good. I mean, no matter what, that's going to still be, you know, a very effective turn that gives us a lot of value. I know because of the fact that I was able to generate some seismics, I was able to go Zealous Belting into a Crippling Crush with effectively very little resources, and those kind of turns are very backbreaking for almost any opponent. Now, when it comes to D-Reacts, even though this deck isn't trying to be on the defensive, you have to understand that you always will be at some point. I run 2 blue unmovables and 1 red. Now, the reason for this is the fact that as much as you want the red, you are very limited in terms of keeping your ratios very efficient. The 2 blue is also to make sure that you have plenty of ways to pitch for that arcane barrier or anything else you might need. Now, 3 sync belows for when I'm going against aggro decks. It's a very efficient way to just filter out and do exactly what I need to do and make sure those critical on hits are not hitting me. And then I ran 3 copies of Red Disable. Now, a lot of people are like, well, why don't you run Crippling Crush, or not Crippling Crush, Command and Conquer, because it's such a great card. Nobody's arguing that Command and Conquer isn't a great card, but at the end of the day, this deck cares about damage numbers and pushing them to that critical point, and one of the ways that this deck is able to do that is by putting out high numbers, and with the Seismic Surges reducing the number, it has to be Guardian attacks. So it's reducing the cost of Guardian attacks, which means the majority of time I'm coming in for 1 blue with a Disable, and I'm threatening 9 damage. And again, it's one of those things where it's also a very easy thing for me to be able to pay into Bravo and be able to force that Dominate in for that critical damage. And especially people have a habit of arsenaling their best card, whether it be a Blood Rush or whether it be, you know, a variety of things such as Art of War. And generally speaking, that is something they don't want to deal with. And it's usually getting at least 2 cards out of their hand, or it's getting me that equipment. And with this deck, once the equipment is gone, your game is almost over. You're definitely getting to that end sequence. But that's pretty much how the deck runs and how it was designed. You definitely start aggressive and you stay aggressive for the majority of the game. The more disruption you can throw out, the better off you'll be.
All right, thank you, Michael. Any final words?
Yeah, I mean, don't be afraid to try it. I mean, I definitely think that even though a lot of people think that tectonic plating is the best way, I think you might be surprised when you go with that Earthlore bounty to see how much value you can get.
All right, thank you so much.
And shout out to all the players over there at Token MTG.